Thank you. Hello. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. My name's Hannah Foxwell, and I'm going to be talking about reliability engineering for humans. Thank you to Leslie for teeing me up a little bit there. So what I'm going to be doing is talking through some of the reliability engineering practices that you might have heard of, but you might not have fully implemented, and you might not have felt the benefit. So I feel like a little bit, this is very much an SRE 101 talk, and I'm kind of preaching to the converted. I mean, give me a little wave if you have or have held the title of SRE in your organization. Yeah, okay, that's quite a few. That's quite a few. So this is an area where you're probably deeply familiar already, but what I'm hoping to do today is to look at some of the practices that you may have implemented through a different lens, through a very human lens, and also potentially share some ideas of how you might improve and evolve on those practices for the benefit of your team. So, this is a slide deck that I think I first shared in 2019. So it's a little bit old. But I do think it's worth just going back over the history of site reliability engineering. So SRE originated in Google in 2003. Ben Traynor was the founder of Google's SRE team and described it as what happens when a software engineer is tasked with what used to be called operations. If you're calling yourself a platform engineer today, and I'm sure a lot of you are, this definition applies as much to you as it does an SRE team. You might be a platform engineering team and also work alongside an SRE team if you're in a big organization. But these domains are exactly as it says. It is what happens when you apply software engineering principles to the stuff that we used to call operations. In 2016, O'Reilly published the SRE book and shared the SRE practices that were evolving at Google with the rest of the world. And I became very interested in SRE at that point, not because of all of the technical nitty-gritty of how you get your monitoring in place and how you build these highly scalable platforms, but because of the language it gave us to talk about reliability. And because of some of the problems that I was seeing across the customers and across the organizations I was working with at the time, where teams were suffering from alert fatigue, where teams were suffering from burnout, where teams were suffering from too much manual toil involved in supporting the platforms that they were building. Reliability engineering is one of those areas that Leslie sort of mentioned, which has this inherent tension to it. It's the response to that tension that has born a lot of these practices. Doesn't matter what kind of organization you are, you will have some users. And your users, their needs will change. That's just how it is. And they'll expect new things, they'll expect improvements, and we want to be able to respond to those needs, because if we stand still, we actually fall behind. Users also expect reliability. They don't often shout about that. That's an unspoken expectation. They expect your service to be available. And so we need to have a system that works. And so there is this inherent tension between change and evolution of whatever product it is that you're building and the stability and reliability of that, because we know that change introduces instability and change can cause lack of availability. The SRE book introduced the SRE hierarchy of needs, which I quite like. I quite like as a model for thinking about reliability. And at the bottom, you'll see it's not surprising that monitoring and data about your reliability is fundamental. And so what I'm going to start with today is I'm going to start with a bit of a refresher about how we measure and how we talk about reliability. Service level indicators, service level objectives, and error budgets. So I'll start with a really simple question of, what level of service do our users need? And what is the difference between what your users need and what your users want? Because if you ask somebody what they want, they'll probably say, I just want it to be available all the time. And that may not be the right answer. That may not be the practical answer. That answer might not even be practically feasible within your context. And so what we need to uncover through investigation is what level of availability, what level of service your users actually need for your service or your product to meet their needs. 100% is never going to be your target because it would cost far, far too much to achieve. Nothing in our world needs to be 100%. You always have this teeny tiny little margin for error, and that's that margin for error that we talk about when we talk about our error budget. There are a lot of ways to organize your teams, and I think the idea that we have a platform team that serves application developers is one that's quite well understood in this room. So I may not introduce that in the way that I normally do, but essentially this is a very simplified model of what your teams and your setup might look like in your organization. So you have application developers who are really focused on your end users. They want to build an amazing product and a valuable service for their users. The next abstraction layer is that platform team, and they have exactly the same mission. They have the mission of building an amazing product and a valuable service for their users. Their users are these folks up here, the application developers. And of course, somewhere, whether it is your cloud provider or an internal team, you've definitely got an infrastructure team somewhere, I promise you. And they are doing the same thing. They're building an amazing product and a valuable service for their users. Every one of these teams should be operating in the you build it, you run it model. What we saw when SRE was introduced to the world is a lot of ops teams rebranded as SRE teams. What we saw in the early days of DevOps was very much the same. The ops team got a new label on it, but their practices and the way they thought about their role, the things that they were building, didn't really change. And so I want to emphasize that. Your platform team isn't your operations team. They're not holding the pager for your developers. They're providing a service that allows the application teams to support their own services on top of the abstraction that they're providing. So depending on where you sit in that stack, and maybe it's a lot more complicated than the picture I've drawn, it probably is if you're part of a larger organization, you will have services that you're providing to your users. And we want our service level indicators to be as close as possible a proxy to your user's happiness. What is your user trying to do? What is your user trying to achieve with your platform? And how can we measure the success of that? A service level objective is a threshold, and it's quite often expressed in terms of like a number of nines, like 99% or 99.9%. But basically, this is your target. This is the percentage of time that you succeed in meeting your users' needs as described by your service level indicator. Service level indicators are so important, and it's one of those areas that I find that teams don't spend enough time on up front. They'll collect a couple of metrics, and they'll say, that's good enough, create some dashboards, please move on, go and build some other stuff. But it's really important to really think about your service level indicators. And here are a few things that I'd encourage you to think about when you go back to the office or your desk in the corner of your living room, like wherever you work, about whether or not your SLIs meet some of these criteria. Are they opaque and are they black box SLIs? Are they measured from outside or inside the system? If they're measured from inside the system, how do you know they're really representative of your user's experience from outside the system? They should be very specific. If there's ambiguity in your SLI, it's not going to be very useful for you. You should be able to code something that can measure it, and you should believe that value when it's returned. They need to be representative of user value. And so if you don't meet your SLO, if that SLI isn't met, it should be a genuine problem. We don't measure things that we don't care about. That wastes everybody's time and energy. And more challenging, but also quite important, is a really good SLI can be architecture agnostic. You should be able to rebuild your entire platform from the ground up without your users knowing about it, and with those SLIs still in place, with those meeting those SLOs. So have a think about how you can maybe measure, from a user's perspective, the success of your platform. That one is particularly hard. I will give that. I will hand that to you. But building synthetic monitoring from outside your platform can be a really good way of understanding the performance of it from the inside. Then we come to selecting the correct SLO. And I've got a bit of a visualization about this that I'll come on to. But things that need to be in place for an SLO to be valuable, it definitely needs to represent business value. Don't put 5 nines on something if it genuinely doesn't matter, if it goes down at the weekend. That's not something that you would do. It should be defensible. It should be something that your whole organization agrees is important and agrees is necessary for you to run your service for your users. Again, as with the SLI, it needs to represent user value. It needs to represent the critical aspects of the user's expectation of the service. If you miss your SLO, it shouldn't be a non-event. It should be a problem for everyone. It should be a problem enough that you do something about it. And quite often I see people set their SLOs too high. And when they don't meet their SLO, they go, did anyone care? No? That SLO is not correct in that case. You should lower your SLO because that gives you opportunities to maybe reinvest the time and energy that you're putting towards resiliency and reliability towards something else that's more valuable for your business. There's lots of different ways to measure SLOs, but I quite like, especially when I'm introducing people to the topic, to reason about them in terms of time. And to reason about them in terms of time, I like to invert the SLO and just express it as the error budget. The error budget is the opposite of your SLO. If your SLO is 99%, then your error budget is that 1%. And over a 28-day period, that means that you have 403 minutes of acceptable downtime or lack of service. So that's what you're aiming for if you've got an SLO of 2 nines. As you go down there, you can see how small those error budgets get. They get very, very small very, very quickly. When you start to get down to like 3.5 nines, 4 nines, you're looking at a level whereby an engineer holding the pager won't be able to resolve an incident without burning through your entire error budget. And so then you can have better conversations about where investment is needed to achieve the service level that you want for your product or your platform. When you get down to 5 nines, which is bonkers, obviously, it's a very, very valuable thought experiment to go, what would it take for us to automatically detect and recover from failure in order to achieve essentially what is very, very, very small amounts of downtime? Again, you can express SLOs in terms of error rates and things like that, but I think when you're getting started, time is a concept that everybody can understand and everybody can reason about, and you're much more likely to have a productive discussion. Again, this is the human element of it. You're much more likely to have a productive discussion if you look at those times in minutes and you say, what will it take for us to achieve that level? And it becomes a lot more useful and practical when you're talking about where you set those SLOs. As I mentioned earlier, these tools and practice help us balance change and reliability, but how does it work in practice? And what do we need to think about when we're setting our service level objectives? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a visualization now. So what we're going to visualize here is there's the probability of something happening on the y-axis there. And on the x-axis, this is the number of nines. This is the increases in your SLOs, the higher and higher targets you set for yourself. And so we'll start with the cost and effort, because as I said, to achieve 5 nines of reliability, that's going to need an awful lot of automation. It's going to need a lot of redundancy. It's going to need a lot of resiliency. There's engineering effort there, and also there's redundant infrastructure, and there is ongoing maintenance and testing to make sure that self-healing ability that you want from your platform or product is actually working effectively. So the cost of achieving more and more availability at that right-hand side is exponential. There's also the probability that somebody is going to notice that very, 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 very tiny outage in your service. And that decreases with the number of nines that you're providing as a service. And so the likelihood that anybody notices tends towards zero, and it tends towards zero very quickly as you get into those very high levels of nines. We, of course, have another line, because depending on the service that you're providing, someone might notice a tiny glitch. But do they care? Are they going to hit refresh? Are they going to try again? Are they going to actually succeed the second time in doing what they needed to do? And so that's a different line. That's actually okay in some scenarios that someone notices an issue as long as they can still eventually achieve what they were trying to achieve. And when we think about it in this way, we want to be implementing the practices within our support processes that are correct and are aligned to the service levels that we actually need to provide for our product. So down at the bottom end, really, like if you've got hours of error budget every month to play with, you could implement a process whereby you're alerted via a user complaint. And this may be absolutely sufficient for an internal-facing tool where your users are only online at certain times of the day, or where the work is very asynchronous and people can come back to it. There might be minimal business impact of a day outage. And that's the reality. And actually, the amount of time and effort you invest in the reliability of that service might not be worth it. As we go up, we can see that we're going to need a lot more automation and a lot more robust engineering to achieve those additional nines. And so, at 3 nines, you're looking at really comprehensive monitoring, alerting, and an on-call schedule with people who are well-trained in how to recover from those outages. As you get up to 4 nines, 5 nines, and beyond, you are looking at engineered solutions. You're looking at automated detection and recovery. You're looking at automated rollback to the last known good release. You're looking at practices like blue-green deployments where you can test changes on a very small population and you can pull them back. So have a think about where you sit as well in terms of the reliability you need and whether or not you've implemented practices that are appropriate for the availability level that you need. I find actually quite a lot of people have implemented this sort of green level. They're like comprehensive monitoring, alerting, but the humans are still very much in the process. And at the same time, they're aiming for really astronomical amounts of availability in 5 nines. And that's just not practical. And it's not fair on the teams who are supporting that service. That is not an achievable SLO for them without serious investment. And when you start measuring your reliability unambiguously, you've agreed some SLIs, they reflect your users' interaction with your product or platform, and you're now measuring the success of how your users are managing to achieve what they need to achieve, you might be surprised at how often they fail. You might be surprised by how low your actual experienced reliability is. And that's okay, because you've got to start somewhere. At least you now know where you are. And so this is why I always remind people, it's better to know where the problems are. It's better to start that journey of measuring the experience of your platform now. And then you can set a target of where you want to be. You can measure those 2 SLOs at the same time in certain cases. So you can achieve the SLO maybe 3 nines today, but what you want to get to is you really feel like you need to get to 4 nines. and you get the investment needed to build the things that are necessary to get to 4 nines. And you can measure your progress towards that target. And I would recommend doing that. You can commit to an SLO that's lower than what your aspirational target is, and you can work towards it. Another thing which is slightly counterintuitive is I actually think that overachieving on your SLOs is less okay. If you're achieving 3 or 4 nines of availability and your service doesn't really need that, where's the waste? Is there waste because you've over-provisioned your infrastructure? That's a problem. That's burning money. That's burning time. That's burning energy. That's not very green. Are you burning money through on-call schedules where the pager never goes off? Are you burning... what was I going to say then? Time, money, energy, people. No, I think that's it. But ultimately, you don't win any favors in your business by over-engineering on your reliability. And your CFO will thank you if you optimize your reliability for the service level that your users actually need, because ultimately that will save you time and that will save you money, and it will unlock the human time and the human potential to go and build more interesting things that can have a bigger impact, that can have more value. Another thing that I always advise people do, and this is something that I don't see a lot of SRE or platform teams doing as a routine and as a ritual, which is to use their error budget to help prioritize. And so I'll talk you through a little bit of an error budget example and how you might reprioritize your backlog based on incidents and based on your error budget. And so you start off your month and you have a full error budget, and then you start to have a little bit of downtime. There's a few glitches, maybe a release went wrong, maybe you rolled back, and oops, we've had a little bit of an outage and people have noticed, and the reliability of our platform is not what we promised it would be. What do you do then? Do you just ignore it and move on? Or do you say, this is unacceptable, and we need to reprioritize, we need to address some of the causes of this extended outage, and so it doesn't happen again, and so that we can reliably stay within our error budget for this service. And it's actually those conversations that are really helpful, because we can't just churn out new features all the time. If we do that, we are going to end up with something that's brittle and unreliable, and our users will start to notice. And so there is a sweet spot of the balance in your backlog. And if you're a product manager for a platform team, these are some of the pieces of information and the data that you might want to be gathering about your users' experience internally of your product. How reliable is it? Do people want to use it? Or do we need to invest in the reliability and the performance of the product? You can go and interview your users, but you can actually collect data on that as well. And you can make prioritization decisions on your backlog to improve how your feature and how your platform is perceived. Another thing that I find is not very simple in the real world. Hopefully I've made some of these concepts appear very simple, and you have some ideas of how you might improve them when you go back. But in the real world, we have lots of teams involved in delivering a service to your end users. So who gets to use the error budget in that scenario? If your Kubernetes cluster goes down and it was hosting hundreds of applications, do those application teams just need to freeze all changes until the platform's recovered? Is that how we're going to work together? And honestly, it kind of doesn't matter. If your users are experiencing an outage, you have a problem. And so when you're reasoning about error budgets, you cannot do it in isolation. You cannot build an application that's serving customers at 5 nines of reliability if your platform team is only promising 3 nines. You simply can't do it, because any issue for the platform is going to impact their users. And so it needs to be a collaborative process, and it also needs to be transparent. And what you will find is the more abstraction layers you have and the deeper in the stack you get, the higher availability and the higher SLOs you are going to need to set. Because if your infrastructure goes down, it impacts everybody. And you might feel slightly removed from the end user pain if you're in one of these internal-facing teams. And so what I would urge you to do is when you're talking about error budgets is to be very transparent about those error budgets and whether or not you're meeting your SLOs, because the people who are relying on your service can then have better conversations about what their error budgets should be, because your error budget may form part of theirs as well. I had a conversation with a bank, and this was quite a few years ago, where I delivered a talk very similar to this. I introduced them to these practices, and they said, we've got no hope. Like, the team we depend on is so unstable and so flaky, and these services that we need to call, like, fail most of the time. And I was like, do you have data? Do you have data to demonstrate that the source of your failures comes from outside of your team and that you're almost, they felt very helpless when I had this conversation with them. And they were like, no, we don't have data. I was like, go and get that data. Go and get that data, because if it's a problem for you, it's a problem for your business. And you need to be advocating for that team, and they will probably be grateful for you advocating for them so that they can invest in the reliability they need to serve their users, and you are their users. But it's amazing how infrequently these conversations actually happen. And so I would urge you to go and have a think about who you depend on and who depends on you, and to build your SLOs and your SLIs collaboratively. And so I said at the beginning of this talk, this is about reliability engineering for humans. And the reason that I was so interested in these practices when they were first brought sort of to light and outside of Google's walls was because of the potential impact they would have on humans. And I have a very old dashboard. And this dashboard was the source of inspiration for me. And it comes from 2018. It's an old pivotal dashboard. But what this dashboard shows is a measure of a team's health. This is a dashboard that used to exist in PagerDuty. And what it did is it pulled together and collated how many sort of human impacting alerts were going out. Were they going out of hours? What was the duration of them? And it collated them into a health score. And I was having a pick through the data with PagerDuty, actually. And we were like, well, that's a very promising trend. You can see that the health score goes from very, very low in the 20s to almost up in the 90s. And so I went and asked this team, and I said, what did you do? And they said, we started to implement SRE practices by the book from Google. And I was like, okay, I'm interested now. So what they did, and this is a team that no longer exists, and I may be the only person who's still out here at conferences telling this story, but what they did was they improved the health of the humans involved in supporting this service. They reduced the MTTA, they reduced their MTTR, and it was the implementation of these practices, the measurement of their SLIs and SLOs, and the scrutiny over their error budget, and the prioritization of the things that were needed to help those humans do their job better. Because I know I've been in organizations where the firefight is very, very real, where you don't have time to do the automation work or the engineering work you need, and sometimes you don't even have time to eat because that pager is going off, and that is an awful and toxic place to exist in. And so I do have a few more slides, but I know I am at time. And so what I will leave you with is a couple of thoughts on psychological safety, because psychological safety is the belief that no one will be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And in a lot of organizations, outages and interruptions in service can be viewed as catastrophes, no matter how small they are. And blame cultures still exist, even though we know how counterproductive they are. So by having data and having a shared language and a shared understanding about the expectations we have on reliability can be an incredibly powerful tool to change your culture and to actually create psychological safety for your team so that you can actually create healthier and happier platform teams. Thank you.